Don't often preach from the book of Ruth. But today, I'm wanting to start a sermon series that we're going to go on into July with a break or two, because Julie and I are going to be out of town for a couple of Sundays. But I wanted to go through a sermon series on the family. I think it's important. There's several different topics that need to be discussed from God's Word, perhaps on a yearly basis or so. And this is one of those. Lessons on family, because as a church, it's what this congregation is made up of. We oftentimes talk about the fact that we are the family of God as a spiritual family. But a family of God is made up of physical families. People who themselves are together under a covenant. In fact, I probably need my button, don't I? In fact, my lesson today is going to be specifically about that covenant. There it is. About the covenant of marriage. Because that is what begins a family. When we're talking about a family unit. Actually, one of the lessons we're also going to have during this series doesn't consider it within a family. We're going to be talking about the single person as well. Sometimes we leave them out. And so in this sermon series, that is one that we're going to be discussing. But for the most part, as far as all the other lessons, we're going to be dealing with a family unit as we consider mother, father, and children. And we're going to be talking about that in that regard because, as I said a few moments ago again, the church is made up of families. And one of the things that can bring a church into trouble is when there is trouble within the families. And so we need to discuss this because of that situation and also because we are supposed to be here for each other in all of our Christian walk, helping each other be able to get through every difficulty that comes into our lives. Normally we talk about that as the difficulty of sin. But as people of a like attitude, of people who recognize Jehovah God as the God of the universe, and His Word is that which we are supposed to follow, and making the commitment of following His Word, of course, we need to be here to be able to help each other in relation to every aspect, including the family. And so as we study this today, I picked two verses that are not talking about marriage. Now, I love these verses because these verses describe a marriage. And by the way, were brought about because of a marriage. This discussion is between two women. Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. Now, the fact that Ruth had married one of Naomi's sons had made a connection between them. And because of that, by the way, we're going to be looking at one of the 3 points that we're going to be drawing from this, that Ruth herself makes talking to Naomi was because of marriage. But obviously not, Ruth and Naomi were connected by marriage, but merely the marriage of Ruth to Naomi's son. Oftentimes we'll look at other verses, and we like to do this, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong. But for instance, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is oftentimes used, 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is oftentimes used in order to talk about how love ought to be in marriage. And 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is not talking about marriage, but it is talking about love. And there certainly is love within marriage. And so we can draw something from it. That's what I want us to do from this. From the text from the words that Ruth says within this text, we do learn something about the connection that should be in marriage. And if it was in marriage, would make the marriage to not only be godly, but to work the way God means it to work. So let's consider that. As I said a few moments ago, Ruth's husband had died. For that matter, Naomi's husband had died. And for that matter, do you remember this name? Orpah? Did I say mother? I meant to say husband. Ruth's husband, I said it right. Ruth's husband had died, Naomi's husband had died, and Orpah's husband had died. You know who Orpah is? Well, Naomi had another son, and his wife was Orpah. They had Naomi and her husband had traveled into a Moabite nation, in the Moabite nation. And there, Naomi's sons had gotten married to Moabites. Ruth is a Moabite, not a Jew. But when she married into this family, she married into this family for life. And with her husband now having died, Naomi had spoke to both Ruth and her sister-in-law, Orpah, and had said to them, you need to go home. I have no more husbands for you. Remember, under Jewish law, the more sons would have married, younger sons would have married the two widowed daughters-in-law. But Naomi only had two sons, and they had died. And so her recommendation to them was to go home. Neither Ruth nor Orpah wanted to leave. But Orpah is finally convinced. Naomi, just prior to the verse that was read a few moments ago by Joe, Naomi tries to convince Ruth to follow her sister-in-law. But that's when we get to the words that was read just a few moments ago by Joe. Let me look at it again. Verse 16. Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. First point. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. The very first marriage in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 2, in those verses, something very similar is said. Now, people question who is saying these words that I'm going to read here in a moment. Some people think Adam is saying it. I tend to believe God the Father is saying these words. Look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, and I think I have pretty good evidence that God is speaking when he says these words. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 reads as following. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast or cleave to his wife, and one flesh. Cleaving. I read the word cleaving there, and my translation actually says to hold fast to his wife. But cleaving is the old American standard, and I like it because it rhymes with leaving. Notice what, and this is one of the reasons I believe God the Father is speaking here. Adam had never known what a mother or father is. Adam and Eve at this point obviously have not even had their children. They had not even become mother and father. And not only that, when you go to Matthew chapter 19, verse 5, Jesus Christ quotes and says that is why he said from the beginning, speaking of God the Father, he said these words to the beginning. But look at the words that is said there. For this reason. For what reason? Because you are now married is the idea. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Leaving, cleaving. Way too often within this world, the leaving doesn't actually occur. Oh, please understand what I'm saying. Yes, they move out of the house. Normally. Sometimes that doesn't even occur. Yes, they move out of the house. Yes, they move in together. They start a life together. But the first time a problem comes up, I'm going home to mother. I heard of a story one time where a father, when the daughter had come home to him after a big argument that had happened within the family, she decided, I can't believe the way he's treating me. I've decided to come home. And the father said, that's exactly what you need to do. Go home. This is not your home anymore. You will always be welcome to come and visit. We will always love to have you with us. But when you married, you were supposed to leave and cleave. God doesn't expect us to get everything right and never get on each other's nerves, does he? He knows that we're going to do that because he knows exactly who we are. God knew enough to prepare Jesus Christ to come and die on the cross before man had even ever sinned. God had the idea of what he was going to do when man sinned. So the idea that God doesn't know that sometimes within marriage difficulties come about is easily taken care of by that knowledge of what God was already prepared for all sin. And so when he said these words here, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. A new family has begun. This is exactly what Ruth obviously had done. She left her family. She, and by the way, Orpah as well, called Naomi her mother. They had now part of a new family. Now, whereas they had been connected, they had their own family with their own husbands, but now that their husbands were dead, Ruth decided she was going to stay with Naomi. By the way, there was nothing wrong whatsoever with Orpah going home to her family. We're going to see this in a few moments, but it's at death that the law of marriage is over. But the concept of where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. That concept is all through the idea of leaving and cleaving. There should be no question whenever a husband is moved to another place of whether or not his wife is going to go with him. Now, my father was in Vietnam twice. My mom didn't go. Not talking about the idea that sometimes there are things that cause a husband and wife not to be able to be together. But the concept of where my home is with you, not with anyone else. Who my family is, my connection is with you. And by the way, this works as well with the husband towards the wife. Way too many times a woman's mother-in-law can cause trouble because a husband has not left his mother and father and cleaved to his wife. The other woman, way too often, can be the mother of the husband, can't it? So that first idea of what Ruth is speaking about is that idea of leaving. Jesus used that same idea. Go to Matthew chapter 19, verse 5. This is not a lesson to discuss divorce and remarriage. That's not where I'm going with that. But I do want to point out when Jesus was asked a question about divorce, he took it all the way back to the beginning. And look at what he says and why he says what he does in verse 5. In verse 5 he says these words. In verse 3 he's asked the question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? Verse 4 he said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female and said, that would be God the Father, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. If that was in verse 6 he goes on to say even tighter, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. If that was the last word on marriage and divorce, what reason would there have been for a divorce? Absolutely none. Again, this is not a question on marriage and divorce. We know what happens when it gets down to verse 9. Not the question. But when Jesus was asked about it, he said, don't you know that this is the way it was made to be? You leave your parents. You become a family. You are now starting a family separate and apart from the families that you grew up in. Not that they aren't still part, you're not still blood related. Not that you cannot go back and visit, but home is now where he is. Home is now where she is. For Ruth, her home, by her decision, was now with her husband's family. Second point, go back to Ruth chapter 1. Made the mistake of taking my marker out. Ruth chapter 1. Your God is my God. You know, if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, do you know what you'll see God telling the Israelites there? He was giving them their instructions for when they entered the promised land. And in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, he told the Israelites not to give their daughters over into marriage with the people of that land. Do you remember the reason they were not to do that? I know, if God says it, then you don't do it. But God this time gives a reason. Do you know the reason? So that your daughters will not start following the gods, the idols of the people of the land. When marriage comes together, Ruth is telling Naomi, I'm now going to follow your God. She was, by the way, a Moabitess. She was not part of the Canaanites that God was talking about in the law. They had married into the Moabite family. By the way, do you realize who this makes Ruth when you look at Matthew chapter 1? Who she is an ancestor of? Because she was married into this Jewish family? She's in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. One of two Gentiles in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. But here we see her saying, I'm now going to follow your God. What happened to Orpah? You know, we never see about Orpah after this, but she goes back home to her family and probably back home to their God. But we see Naomi here saying, your God will be my God. Ruth saying to Naomi, your God will be my God. It's so important within a marriage to have God be a part of it. You know, it's oftentimes been described, and I think correctly so. Marriage is not a marriage between two people. Marriage is a marriage between three persons. The third person within every marriage needs to be God. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 6, we read it just a few moments ago, but God continues with these words, and what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Way too often within the world today, people will get married and forget about thinking about God. God needs to be the center of every marriage. This is an important thing, by the way. Say something to you who are single and you who are still children. An important person to remember within any marriage. One day, if this world lasts long enough and someone asks you to marry him or her, guys, one of the first things that needs to be thought of is, who's that person's God? Is that person the same God you are worshiping? Is that person following the same God that you are following? Because I can guarantee you within a marriage, if it's not, there's going to be some trouble. Jesus makes it clear that God joins marriages together. In 1 Peter chapter 3, turn to 1 Peter chapter 3, the connection of God within a marriage. 1 Peter chapter 3. In 1 Peter chapter 3, we see the connection of God within the marriage. I love this set of verses because it mostly speaks to the wife. But it says something in one verse so strong towards the husband that it basically makes up for the extra six verses the wife is told. Look at what it says in here. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if they do not obey the word, they may be won over by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the wearing of gold, or the putting on of clothing, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of the gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Why is God being mentioned? Because he's part of this marriage. Your God will be my God. means that when there is trouble going on, in this particular case, Peter's talking about the problem, the trouble of the husband not being the kind of husband he ought to be. The problem, the trouble of the husband not being the kind of Christian he ought to be. And when that problem is going on, Peter is saying, you still do what you're supposed to do. And he says it because God is involved in your marriage. You know, just because the one spouse is not doing what he or she is supposed to do doesn't let the other spouse off the hook, does it? Why? Because God's still there. And God is doing what he's supposed to be doing. It does not give one or the other, let them off the hook because a covenant of marriage was made. He goes on to tell husbands the way they are supposed to be treating their wives. And when he says it there in that verse, he makes it clear you need to take care of the needs of your wife, because if you don't take care of the needs of your wife, then God's not going to take care of your needs. Why? Because God is involved in the marriage. It's important for us to recognize that phrase, your God shall be my God, is not just an idea of who are we going to worship, but it is the idea of recognizing who is in attendance in that marriage. Finally, the third point. You know, in the custom of that day, especially among the Jews, but obviously it seems to have been among the Gentiles, at least the Moabites, Ruth calls a curse down on her head. Do you see the curse in that verse? Look at that third point. Let me let you look at that third. Now I can't turn it back. It's recording. Okay, here's that third point. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and much more also, if anything but death parts me from you. Notice what Ruth is saying. She's calling a curse down on her head. If what? If I don't stay with you like I'm promising. Now, we call that, in our marriage ceremonies, we call that part of the marriage oath, don't we? You take this, your wedding vows, don't we? Until death do we part. That's the same thing that Ruth is saying to Naomi. You know, you will always be my mother. You will always be connected to me. Until death do we part, I'm going to be staying with you. That same concept is given within God's Word. We studied about it this morning in Romans chapter 7. In Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, Paul uses the illustration of marriage. And in that illustration of marriage, he shows that according to God, which he's part of the marriage, according to God, a woman or a man, as we discussed this morning, is bound to their spouse as long as he lives. Therefore, a woman is bound to her husband while he lives, but if a husband dies, she's released from the law of marriage. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law. And if she marries another man, she is not an adulteress. There's way too many people in the world today that think, well, if it doesn't work out, I'm just going to leave. And within the marriage today, God says that doesn't work. When I put a marriage together, let no man put it asunder. And way too often, people who are willing to put it asunder at any situation whatsoever aren't putting the work into the marriage, aren't willing to put the work into the marriage that it takes. Marriage is a lifelong prospect. If you're not willing to go all the way to the end, don't get married. Do not get married. By the way, there's nothing wrong with not getting married. Paul the Apostle pointed to himself in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, saying it's a good way to be. And we'll talk about that under single people. But as we saw with Ruth, she wanted to be part of that family for life. And that's exactly what occurs whenever one makes a covenant. Marriage is a wonderful creation of God. And when we use it the way God has given it, we are able to do wonderful things in His service. Doesn't mean there isn't going to be problems. All it means is with God's help, we can make it through it. The lesson this morning has been one to starting off this series talking about the family. And that family is built upon marriage. If you are wanting to become a Christian today, that's another covenant decision. A covenant to be connected to God through the blood of the death of His Son. It grants us eternal life. By the way, there's problems that come with that too. And way too many times, people get fed up, get tired, and leave that marriage as well at their own cost. When you become a Christian, it's a lifelong process. Except there's one difference between that and marriage. When death occurs, we go home to the bridegroom. If you are a Christian and you've not been sticking with the one you are engaged to, betrothed to, you have not been doing His will, and I'm talking about that spiritual relationship with God, you have the opportunity to make that right as well. If there's any way that we can help you at all, let us know as we stand and sing.